Windows is the most used operating system on home setups. You can use it for office work, video editing, playing video games, and much more. But with all the problems we have with Microsoft or other big tech companies, we should ask ourselves why we don't switch to alternatives. This is the story about the power of tech companies, explained by the example of Microsoft and Windows. Chapter 1. I want data. It is no mystery that Microsoft collects data from their users. But what data do they collect and why? When talking about data collection by companies, we should first ask ourselves what companies are allowed to collect and for what reason. Here we will look at this with the rules of the EU and the rules of California. First off, in both examples, the companies have to have a specific reason for why they collect our data, and they can only collect for that specific reason. Furthermore, the collection must be transparent. This means that the consumer has to be informed about the reason mentioned in the first point and what exactly is collected. Other regulations that both examples have is that the data must be stored securely so no one else can access your private data. The difference between the EU and California is that in the EU, the user has to agree before the company can collect the data. On the other hand, the user in California has to disagree so that the company cannot collect data. As long as the user does not say no to the company, it is allowed to collect data from the users. All in all, it is also important to know that the rules in the USA vary from state to state, but are pretty similar to one another and to the ones in the EU, though the regulations in the US are not as strict as in the EU, giving the companies more space to collect data. Now we will look at what Microsoft really collects from their users and whom they share the data with. Therefore, we will separate this part into two sections. The first one is specifically for Windows, and the other one is about the general privacy statement from Microsoft. The most interesting point of the Windows license term is point 3 about privacy and the consent of the use of data. It is stated that some parts of Windows software collects and sends some data while being in use, although many of those parts of the software can be turned off. This data may be used by Microsoft as further described in the Microsoft privacy statement. Then there's also point 6 of the Windows license term, which states that the system can update itself without informing the user about it. That on its own might be a problem for some users, but we should also consider that this can introduce new software to the system that collects and sends data. So if I turn off all the software that collects data from me, the update can introduce new software that I don't know about that now collects my data again. We need to be fair and say that this is not really likely, and most of the times the user is informed about the update, but still it is a possibility that Microsoft keeps open. The Microsoft privacy statement can be grouped into multiple categories, with the first one being overall statements. Microsoft states that some of the data is received directly by the user. That means that the person opening a Microsoft account types in their address, name, age, etc., and this is transferred to Microsoft. Other data is collected by activity. This means that there are, for example, cookies that collect decisions made. If the user decides to click on link 1 instead of link 2, this would be an activity that can be collected by Microsoft. It is also possible that Microsoft does not only collect data on its own, but also with the help of other companies. This can mean that subsidiaries collect data, or it could also be interpreted in a way that Microsoft buys user data from other companies. Then Microsoft states at last that the user is forced by law to give them some information when concluding a contract. This means that the user trying to buy an Office license cannot just not give information to Microsoft. Then there's the use of data. The first reason for the data collection is so Microsoft can provide updates, do troubleshooting, or share data for transactions. For example, if the computer runs into a problem, Windows can send the error information to Microsoft so they can look into it and provide a solution. Another point that follows the first one is the development and improvement of products. Then there is the personalization of products and recommendation. Advertising is the most common example for this. When Microsoft knows that the user does not like shoes, it will probably not show an ad for shoes, but for something the user would buy. Other reasons for the collection of data is the analysis of the performance of programs and Windows, including not only home PCs, but also servers worldwide. But the most interesting and probably most controversial point is that Microsoft builds and trains AI, like their large language model Copilot, with the collected data. Every search the user makes, every document the user saves in a Microsoft-owned cloud is used to feed the AI with knowledge. The third category is how Microsoft treats the user data. First off, the data is processed by a human or an AI. It may be uncomfortable for the user that a human looks through personal details, but we have to be fair and say that at least someone has to look through the error codes, etc., so Microsoft can learn from them. Then there is the process of hash matching. This is a process to find illegal contents like child pornography. Every photo, every document, and every video can be converted into a so-called hash. The same video will always generate the same hash, but it is impossible to recreate the video, photo, or document only with the hash. So when the user has a private video on a cloud owned by Microsoft, the hash will be generated and then compared to the hashes of illegal content. If there is a match, Microsoft knows what content you own and has to report that. But if there is no match, nothing happens and Microsoft does not see your content at all. This is a process that is legal in both the EU and the United States. They don't have to do it, but in the US, they are more or less forced to do so because it gives them some sort of immunity when someone uses their services for illegal actions, because they at least tried to prevent it. Then Microsoft states that they share data with third-party companies and subsidiaries of Microsoft. This does not specify whether or not Microsoft earns money with this or not. At last, Microsoft states what they will also share when necessary. When using Microsoft services, you should be aware that Microsoft will share your emails on Outlook, your private files on OneDrive, and your BitLocker keys that can be used to decrypt your entire hard drive when they are legally forced to do so by the government, when they have to protect their users, organizations, or the general public, their infrastructure, or the rights or property of Microsoft. This is a controversial point of the privacy statement. Many people want privacy and don't want to risk that their emails, files, or BitLocker keys are given to the government. The problem with this is that Microsoft is legally forced to share this. So this is a point that many people dislike, but we also have to consider that no cloud service is free from this. So the only option against this is to run everything locally on your PC. Microsoft also states that they use certain cookies, though they don't give a complete list of cookies they use, but only a summary of what most of them do. Uses for cookies are saving settings made by the user, identifying the web browser in use, identifying a specific person, identifying the country the user is in, getting an encrypted version of the user's region, postal code, age, gender, and proficiency, if identifiable, and recording decisions. So all in all, they say that they use cookies to collect the data they use. Chapter 2. Why? The data collection is something many people complain about, But if this is such a great issue, why doesn't Microsoft change something about their behavior? The first step in analyzing this is to look at the market share of the Windows operating system in home setups. In this chart, we can clearly see that the market share of Windows, here in dark blue, is falling. In 2009, Windows was used in about 95% of all setups, while in 2026 it is only used in 60% of the home setups, while alternative operating systems like OS X and its follower macOS become increasingly popular. Even Linux has a market share of about 4%. But this chart only shows how popular Windows is, but we also have to consider that Windows is not the only part of Microsoft's ecosystem. Yes, most of the features Microsoft offers are directly tied to Windows, like the Xbox Game Pass, if you leave consoles out of this conversation, but we can do that. But many products like Microsoft Office 365 can also be used on macOS. So the next chart shows us the value of Microsoft as a whole, or at least the value of Microsoft's shares. As we can see, Microsoft only became more and more valuable over time. This also means that Microsoft's strategy seems to work, and there is no need for them to change anything when the system they are using only pays out for them. Chapter 3: Linux. Linux is an open source operating system without the negative sides of Windows, as we have listed before. But still, Linux has only a market share of about 4%. So why don't we use Linux more, and what exactly is the difference between Windows and Linux? Besides that there is no one big tech company behind Linux. First off, let's talk about the advantages Windows has to offer. One of the most important factors is that Windows has a good UI. It may not be perfect, and other operating systems also have a good UI, but still this is a major point why people use Windows. Then there is software compatibility. While it is pretty easy to find software that does not run on Linux operating systems, it is pretty difficult to find software that does not run on Windows. Yes, there are alternatives for basically every software someone will ever use in their lives. But if someone is already a professional in Adobe Photoshop, you can't expect him to just get the same result from alternatives like GIMP. Not because GIMP is bad, but just because it is different. We also have to acknowledge that Windows is not a bad operating system. Although we don't like that Microsoft collects the user's data with Windows, this does not automatically make Windows bad. Other critiques about Windows as an operating system are that Windows is unstable, but this is only kinda true. Yes, for some tasks Windows is not the best choice, but for gaming and office work, for example, many people will never ever experience Windows crashing in their entire life. Another factor is that Windows is often pre-installed when you buy a PC in a store. This is because hardware distributors can sell many add-ons for Windows like Microsoft Office 365, antivirus software, Adobe licenses, and much more. And even if you don't buy any of the add-ons, now you have Windows on your PC, and why change it when you already have it? Some reasons why people do not switch to Linux are based on myths that we are now going to explore. But before, I want to give you a brief overlook about what Linux means. Linux is not one operating system like Windows. Linux is just a part of an operating system. When we talk about Linux, we mean all distributions that share the same kernel Linux. A distribution, or short distro, is a standalone operating system. But because they all share the Linux kernel and some other parts of the system, they all behave in a comparable way. Some distros have earned a logo on a place on this side. From left to right we have Fedora, Debian, Linux Mint, Ubuntu, and Arch Linux. All of these distros have different advantages and disadvantages that are not important for now. The first myth is that Linux is unstable. This is as true and false at the same time as the statement that Windows is unstable. Yes, some tasks can crash the system, but normal work of a PC is no problem at all for Linux. This may vary between different distros. Most of the distros are completely stable, but for example, Arch Linux is like a Lego box, and you have to build the operating system yourself. So if you do something wrong, this can definitely result in instability. But if you use, for example, Fedora, Ubuntu or Linux Mint, you won't have any issues with the stability. The second myth is that Linux has many bugs. This is like the first myth. The major distros are extremely good looked after, and because the code is open to everyone, Linux has a better bug fixing routine than Windows, for example. When Windows has a bug, someone from Microsoft has to search for the bug and fix it. But with Linux, there are thousands of people searching for the bug and thousands of people contributing to a solution. So naturally, bugs are fixed faster and definitely not worse than bugs in Windows. The third myth is that Linux has no support for bleeding edge hardware. This is kinda true and kinda false. Like the other myths before, this varies between every distro. For example, Arch Linux is a rolling release distro, what means that updates come as soon as they are available, what also includes hardware support. But for example, distros like Fedora need some time until they support bleeding edge hardware, because in distros like Fedora, updates are tested on their extremes before being available for the users. This is just a weighing of options. Do you want to have a system that is as stable as it can be, or do you want to get updates the second they are more or less ready and accept that this can cause some problems? The last myth we are going to look at is that you have to be a genius to be able to use Linux. Like all the other myths, this is not true per se. Most of the distros are even simpler to use than Windows. We will look at some examples how things work later. If you take Linux Mint for example, this is one of the go-to distros recommended to newbies migrating from Windows. Linux Mint behaves similar to Windows, looks similar and feels similar. But there are also distros like Arch, and you definitely need to be somewhat smart or at least want to invest many hours into setting up the system. What you may have noticed is that every distribution works differently, and this is actually an advantage of Linux. No matter what you want from an operating system, there will be a distro that matches your needs. You probably need to try some distros before finding the right one, but most distros are installed in 15 minutes or less, even if you know almost nothing about computers. You will definitely not like every distro, but this does not mean that they are bad. For example, I don't like Linux Mint, but I still recommend it to people because I know that it is perfect for many people. It just wasn't the right distro for me, and you will experience similar things. I don't like Mint, but I love Fedora and Arch. But you may hate Arch and Fedora, but love Mint and Ubuntu. But now let's talk facts. What keeps people from switching to Linux that is actually true? First off, we have to accept that Linux is different than Windows. Yes, Mint is an example I made for being similar to Windows, but it still is not the same. This does not have to be a bad thing, but it still means that people migrating to Linux have to learn something new. And why learn something new if the old thing still works? Second, we have to know that some programs won't run on Linux. Examples for that are Adobe Photoshop, Microsoft Office 365, video games with a aggressive anti-cheat software, and so on. Some programs like Microsoft Office can run on Linux over the web browser or have good alternatives like LibreOffice, while other programs have software in between and run perfectly on Linux, like most video games via Proton from Steam. But some programs will not run at all, not even with a translation layer. One option against this problem is to emulate Windows on your Linux PC. But why emulate Windows if you could just install it? At last, some external hardware can run into problems. Most of it will work like computer mice and keyboards. But some specific hardware, like a machine for setting up hearing aids, won't work on Linux. Though the last example won't affect the home user because no one but a company will ever have a machine for setting up hearing aids. Now let's look at the difference between some normal things someone would do on a computer. The first example is writing a document. Here comparing Microsoft Word on the left with the LibreOffice Writer on the right. As we can see, there are some differences from the style, but overall both options can do the same things. Both can write on pages, both can change font size, color, underlining, etc. Both can export as PDF and. I think you get it. The second example is how to install something. Here we will install Blender. On the left is an example how we install Blender on Windows. We go onto the website of Blender, click on download, and then we download a installer.exe. We open that file, agree to the terms of use, and then Blender installs itself to our system. On the right we have two options on how to install Blender on Linux. The upper option is installing Blender via the software manager. This may look a little bit different on every distro, but it is basically the same everywhere. You search for the app, click install, and then you can just open the program and it is ready to use. The second option is to install it via the terminal. This also varies between every distro because they use different package managers, but it still works pretty similar. On Fedora we type sudo dnf install blender. We press enter our password, agree to it being installed, and then it installs itself. On Arch we will type sudo pacman-s blender. On Ubuntu sudo apt install blender. So what can we learn from this? Microsoft collects our data when we use their services. Although Windows is losing market share in home setups, Microsoft is valuable more than ever before, so there is no need for Microsoft to change anything. Windows is not a bad operating system. Linux is not better, but it is also not worse. It is just different than Windows. Microsoft has an advantage with Windows that compensates the negative sides. Most of the software is only made for Windows and many people depend on this software, so there is no real threat to Microsoft.